wonderful to be given the opportunity to speak with Ken. And I have to tell you that I've admired his work. I told him I was a fan of it today. I'm not a closet fan, an open, fully fledged, face-to-face fan. But while we were talking, a few years ago, I did a qualitative conversation with Ken, and he embodies who he is in a very visceral way that works for all of his scholarship and especially for autoethnography. And when he came to our little beach shack in Cornwall, he talked about his upbringing, and those stories, a bit like some of Ron Pelias's stories and Carolyn's stories, when you hear them, they find a place in your body and they stay there. And so I started by asking Ken, would you take us back to Ken, that little boy, born in a place called Launceston, which, if you look at how it's spelt, it's Launceston, but he told us how to pronounce it properly. And I just like you, Ken, just to talk about, you know, that part of the country and how it shaped you and your work.
Okay, Kitrina, thanks very much. I mean, I find that really complimentary, and it's lovely to sort of for you to cast me back to the experience I had of being brought up in Cornwall. You know, as I often say, I don't consider Cornwall as a part of England. For me, it's a Celtic region. It's on the fringes. It was surrounded by sea, and it's the word visceral is really important. We're very close to the land. You know, mining and fishing and so on is really important. But I think perhaps, you know, with the developments that are happening in the world at the moment, the upturn of neoliberalism and market-driven forces and so on, one of my sort of big memories of living as a young person in the 1950s was how we had social systems, how we had nationalized industries, we had state-owned water companies and so on and so forth. And it was a very different, and that was a normality. And it's very, very, so I now make the contrast with the kind of forces that are governing us and the greed and the corruption and so on that's within the sort of neoliberal marketplace. And that's really making me reflect back to the period when I was, you know, brought up. It's life is very, very different now. So I think, you know, what you were saying about having that embedded in me is the contrast, really. You know, what was a beautiful way of being brought up is now being challenged for many of our young children because of these sort of the greed and the corruption and the market forces, which are based upon profit and nothing else. So you know, there's that aspect feels like a negative, and that's why I suppose I'm always a socialist at heart, you know. I think also, I mean, in terms of my work, I mean, I think, you know, there's always, as you know, probably one of the sort of major motives in my work, and I don't mean this in a metaphorical sense, I think is being with the sea. And I've spent a lot of, like you, spent a lot of time around and with the sea, and that's always been a powerful energetic force for movement in my work as well as my sort of my life generally. So we share that, I guess, don't we?
Describe it a little bit, because I know lots of people here aren't from the southwest of England.
Yeah.
And you know, when we were in Florida, golden sandy white beaches, turquoise ocean, quite flat. Sure. Where you come from, it couldn't be more different to that.
It's pretty much, I mean, at the moment, it's pretty much completely the opposite to that, because we faced all of the westerly winds that come right across the Atlantic from the States. I mean, as you know, the seas are always rough. We've got high, rugged cliffs. So swimming in the sea down here is a real adventure, and it's never very far away. I'm sometimes out in my garden and I can hear the waves breaking on the shore, and it's nice to have that sense of immediacy of the sea. I mean, you get a real sense of different geological time. You get a real sense of how small we are, and you also get a real sense of how some of the problems that I was talking about just now are kind of can be minimized when you find yourself, you know, in the power of the sea. It's ever present for me. It really is a powerful force. I don't mean it in a metaphorical way. It energizes me. You know, that word visceral that you used just now is really very apt.
It's very humbling being in the ocean.
Yeah, yeah.
So take us from that little boy that grew up in Launceston, who
Yeah.
you talk about. It was quite a poor background. You know, your parents weren't extremely wealthy. You didn't have an indoor toilet. You had to. What was it? The story you told me about carrying your basin at night down the corridor. You didn't need to spill any of it after you'd used a bedpan, you know, for the morning. Take us from
some of those aspects. Now I look back on them now, and I mean, I think, you know, it's though it was poverty. I mean, when they knocked the little cottages that we lived in, when they knocked them down, they talked about slum clearance, and you know, we never thought of them. We never thought of it as living in slums. But you're absolutely right. I can remember my mother every day had to go out the front door, down the main road, and up the back passage. Pardon the pun, to get rid of all of the toilet residues. So it was. And I was thinking again of another thing in relation to that in terms of the time. You know, I was born in 1947 in a very poor working class environment, and I have a picture of my dad, which my mother found when she was going through his books after he died, and we found a picture of him in a landing craft at D-Day in June 1944, and it's startling because I thought of him as a very tender, very caring, very humble, and a very deep man, and a wonderful father. And there, in that picture, 3 years before, he was in the hell and high waters of the D-Day landings. You know, so that juxtaposition of those two different energies of a young man fighting in a war, and then a guy who was a wonderful father. You know, so how these things come into focus when I reflect back on my childhood in a small Cornish town. It's it's very, very powerful. And it's not that I want to sort of repeat them necessarily, because they're always different, but they do enforce the way in which I live my life now, in terms of the responsibilities I have, and you know, what I want to do in my own work as well. I mean, I think we were talking earlier on, I tend not to see a separation between the work and the writing that I do and the rest of my life. It's all wound up together, really. It's all wound up together.
Very ecological.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah, it is. And yeah, I think it's a word that's overused, but I think in terms of movements, that getting an understanding of the ecology of self in relation to others is really, really important. You know, there's I mean, we maybe come to talk about it later on, but as you know from my work, I think much more about processes of change and relational links between human bodies, but also the material world, and that's, you know, that comes through that sense of ecological connectedness. So I think that's I think it's really, really important.
Do you think that comes because you're so connected to the sea and the physicality of where you are? Just a thought I had there.
I mean, it's hard to say really, because I don't think it's a rational thing. I think, you know, people are now talking about the distinction between the neurotypical, the rational, sensible, normatively constructed individual, and the neurodiverse. And I'd never felt there was a sort of neurotypical way in which I was aware of my surroundings in a rational sense. But I think that kind of frisson, that kind of connectedness with the materiality, particularly when you're in such a vibrant natural environment as Cornwall, you know, with the moors and so on. And I think it impacts upon you. Yeah, it does something to you. You know, what Spinoza says, it's not so much what a body means, but it's what a body can do. You know, and I think that connectedness with the world. If you've been in, as you say, the sea is a very humbling place, isn't it? You know, when you're swimming and you suddenly feel a rip tide pulling on your ankles, it's, oh my goodness, you know. So I think, yeah, I think it's not a, I wouldn't say it's a conscious rational thing, but it is about the connectedness with the material world as well, which I think is really, really important, particularly when maybe we're going to talk in a moment about autoethnography and so on. I think it's really important in terms of autoethnographic practices as well. So
just take us momentarily into sort of your day job and how you got into that position and what you do now. I mean, you've written so many books as sole author with other collaborators. You know, how has that journey happened?
Well, Do you want the history or the? I mean, because where I am now, I mean the history. I was so sorry to miss the session with Norman this morning, because although I would never put myself in any comparative sense close to Norman, but like Norman, I did sociology and philosophy before I ended up in the kind of research methodological works that I do now. So I mean I lived through the 60s, yeah, and that was it. And I remember talking to someone when I was living in London, and they were saying how they were going to go back and go to university. And I thought that sounds like a good laugh. That sounds like a good idea, and ended up going to university to study philosophy. And my dad, in a really joking way, said, "Well, he said most philosophy undergraduates are unemployed, but it didn't matter. You know, it was that kind of thing." Very different to today, when I look at the campus, and all around the campus, it's not inducing and encouraging young people to study philosophy or chemistry or sociology or whatever it may be, but it's about getting a job. You know,
Yeah,
university
absolutely,
education now is about do this course. You know, the whole subjectification of our students now is that to make them as consumers rather than people who can come to universities and be creative people. So for me, it was a great, opportunistic period, really. But then I mean, I finished a philosophy degree, got a certificate in education, and thought, well, what can you do with a philosophy degree apart from teach philosophy? But I mean, I gradually sort of morphed through various sort of teaching on various courses, and then ended up at Plymouth, which is the university across the water to where I live. And I've been teaching there for 20 years now, mainly sort of teacher education and doing philosophy of education there. So that's a sort of short snapshot, really.
So I suppose when I first became aware of your work was when I was at the University of Bristol doing my PhD.
Yeah, sure.
And there was an education conference on there that David and I performed across the Tamar. And we saw one of the other presentations was two men talking.
Yes.
And this was two people who were doing a joint PhD. Now, this is so PhDs are supposed to be your own work. There's no collaboration. Often people talk about it being a lonely journey. How on earth did you come to that point?
Well, I suppose that, I mean, it's a lovely question, and I love talking about this because it brings into focus a person who's hugely dear to my heart, and it wells up inside me when I think about Jane Speedy. Yeah, because Jane Speedy ran the doctoral, as you know, ran the doctoral programs at Bristol University at that time. And I remember seeing the Jane's program advertised and thought, I want to go for that. And, we had it, and Jonathan was the other man in the two men talking kind of thing. But Jane was just wonderful because for those of you who know Jane and have met her, she's a force to be reckoned with. She's an absolute force. And I think the two men talking, the Gale and Wyatt couple, if you like, that between the two came about because we said to Jane, but I think we were maybe about a year into our PhD studies, and we said, can we do it together? And it was basically said, well, we'll see what we can find out. And as a consequence, I mean, you might have seen it as a consequence of that experience. Myself and Jonathan and Jane wrote a paper called Gate Crash in the Oasis. I don't know if you've seen it. And that talks about that experience. And it was interesting because Jane supported us all the way through. Bless her, she was so wonderful in doing that. But it was interesting at that time, which was the early 2000s, how a big, highly reputed civic university like Bristol, she said, I pushed on a lot of doors and I was surprised to find that they opened. It wasn't that hard. It certainly wasn't hard for Jonathan and I. I think Jane might have had a few sleepless nights getting us through. But I mean, it was a great experience. It was fantastic.
What do you think, that collaboration brought to the work you do now? Because you seem to have gone on a journey with collaborations. I'm replacing Suzanne now, who you've collaborated with, and there have been Tammy Spry that you've talked about as well, and Ron, and so you're continually making and forging these things. What does it bring?
it's a great, I mean, I could theorize that, but I prefer not to. I mean, I think that really the spirit of collaboration really infuses me. I think that there's a side, even though I'm probably an egomaniac, there's a there's a side to me that's really quite shy, yeah, and quite reserved. And I think, you know, having a confidant, you know, having a friend, having a co-conspirator, whatever we want to call the significant other that you write and work with, I think it gave me a lot of confidence to be able to work with someone else. I mean, it's lovely being, it's great that you and I can have this conversation, because we can, the phrase we used this afternoon, which I caught from Jane Speedy, we can riff off of each other, can't we? You know, and we can extemporize, and we can improvise, and we can innovate, and we could do things which I would say are creative practices, which perhaps we might not have so much confidence to do them if we're working in isolation and on an individual way. So again, I don't think I sort of got into collaborative practices because I'd rationalized it. It was much more that it somehow happened. You know, Jane wrote about it and saying something like the force between those two, they met and then they were off. You know, and you couldn't stop us. You know, and I think it was. Yeah, that's how I would say I do enjoy the connectedness, because I think, you know, I would say, going back to the philosophy of Spinoza again, you know, we're all connected. Yeah, that all bodies have the capacity to affect and be affected. We're all connected. It's just that quite often philosophies, particularly rational philosophies like Descartes' philosophies, tends to think about us as the isolated individual. You know, I think therefore I am is a classic example of that. So I suppose, yeah, Jonathan and I was the first collaboration I got involved in, and then it became a little bit like a forest fire, because the two men talking paper, which you mentioned that we presented in Bristol, our first trip to ICQI, which I think was 2004, was that the first Congress? I think it was 2004, 2005. I'm not absolutely sure.
2005.
Jonathan,
Christopher
2005 was it? Yeah.
Telling us,
I mean,
yes.
it was amazing. I think there were about 400 people, and I know Jonathan and I, you know, very naive, felt like youngsters going there. And we presented the paper, Two Men Talking, at a shed on the edge of the campus somewhere. And there were about 10 or 15 people there, and it was great. And in the presentation of the paper, we name checked Bronwyn Davis and Suzanne Gannon, because we'd already read their work on collective biography, and which was, you know, and that was great. And at the end of the presentation, this short, dapper but very fierce-looking Australian woman came up to us and said, "I'm Bronwyn Davis," and Bronwyn introduced herself to us. She'd been in the audience, and it was lovely. She was very gracious about the way we'd cited her work and how we talked about her approach to collective biography. And that was the beginning of a collaboration. Yeah, through that experience, you know, we probably had a coffee or a beer, I can't remember. And then she introduced us to Suzanne, who I don't think was at the conference that year, but maybe came the next year. And then we found all four of us had a mutual interest in the work of Deleuze. So we worked together on a book which was called Deleuze and Collaborative Writing, which came out, I think, in about 2011. So it would have been great to have had Suzanne here to talk about that, because what was fascinating about it was like two blokes in the UK and two girls in Australia collaborating across, you know, thousands and thousands of miles. And I remember the first time we got together with our transcripts was in, I think it's the park by the Arts Institute in Chicago. And we got together, and it was you used the word, when we were talking this afternoon, you used the word epiphany. And it was almost like a spiritual moment, because we arranged to meet in this little area in the park by the Arts Institute off Michigan Avenue. And there was a real force there when the four of us met. And we sat in a little circle. We were going to do a presentation at the conference. And it was very, very powerful. It was very, very powerful to be with those embodied spirits who we've been writing with for a year or so. So I think so. I suppose is that those magnetisms have always drawn me to collaborative work. I suppose. I mean, I've done stuff on my own, as you know. The two most recent books I've written on my own, but I still feel I'm collaborating. I've sort of invented a concept in the book that I've just written of spiriting. Yeah, that I feel that in my writing I can spirit up, using the word spirit as a verb. I can spirit up you, I can spirit up Ron Pelias, I can spirit up people, I can bring them into the concoction. So although they're not tangible, their viscerality is, if you like, here or here, I can spirit them up. So I feel as if the collaboration is always there. I welcome it, because I think, well, you know, if Kitrina was looking over my shoulder, what would she be thinking about this? She'd say, oh, that's a load of old rot, Ken, or something like that. So yeah, collaboration has always been important. Yeah, yeah.
What also
That was a long
seems
answer, sorry.
what also seems in tandem with your organic way that you work and
Yeah,
that collaborative spirit and the desire and the dynamism and the sort of the way that you work with others, and that spurs you on, is also you do have a theoretical philosophical bent. And ever since I've known you, you've always talked about Deleuze and Guattari. They seem to be very prominent in your work. So
sure.
maybe you could talk about that side of things as well.
Yeah, it's hard to find an in, Kitrina.
Well,
I'd
go back to the
like,
book that you did with Suzanne, perhaps, and
yeah.
what was it that you were trying to get that book to show, to give, to help people to see?
I think the first thing, and this is, I mean, obviously studying philosophy as an undergraduate was great. I mean, I loved it. And prior to I didn't go to university as an undergraduate until I was 25, because I was having so much time and good fun in London, you know, going to parties and raves and all that sort of stuff. But studying philosophy gave me a real, I don't know, a desire to explore people's ideas. I mean, I love that whole idea of working with ideas. And I really, really love, you know, Deleuze's idea that we shouldn't pick concepts off of the shelf. We should make them up. Yeah, we should make up our own concepts. We should form our own concepts. Yeah. So I think that was a really important point, and sort of starting me off on the sort of pathway that I've, you know, gradually reached, if you like. Not that I consider this to be an end point. But one thing that I think that was significant for me was offering the challenge to, I don't know whether it was Norm Denzin or who. It was one of the sort of, a lot of people like Carolyn and Art and people came through, the early people who were challenging the old traditional research methodologies. And I got really hung up by disliking the binary that people set up between theory and practice, that somehow or another we've got a whole bunch of ideas over here, theory, and then over there we've got practice. So I don't think I invented the term, but I certainly have used it to death. I like to say theorizing is practice. Yeah, theorizing is doing. In other words, it's not a binary. There's an elision between theory and practice. So, for example, a lot of post-qualitative researchers are now talking about using speculative practices. Yeah, so not asking what something is, but what if we do this? What if we try this out? So that we put the theory into practice. You know, Deleuze says, you know, a concept is like a brick. You know, you can throw it, you can use it to build a courthouse of reason, or you can chuck it through the window. And so I suppose it was that sort of being able to use ideas and ideas to change the world, I suppose. You know, as I say, I've been being brought up in the 1950s in the UK, when, you know, there was a lot of, you know, socialism was very, very powerful. Being brought up as a socialist because my dad was a trade unionist, you know, I think, you know, looking at those ideas and often having to defend those ideas with, you know, in arguments with people who perhaps wanted to challenge them. So I've always enjoyed that cut and thrust, arguing with people, testing something out, doing the speculative what if thing. I think that's for me, it's a really research creative practice, which we have to do.
And what about the more recent book? I think, is it Writing with Immanence?
Yeah.
Is that the more recent one? So
Yeah.
how did you evolve from that? Because your work tends to move on. What was your thought behind the most recent one?
Oh, it's hard to, I can't really be sure of the lineage. I remember thinking about there's a British empiricist philosopher called Alfred North Whitehead, and with Bertrand Russell in the 1930s, they wrote together a book called Principia Mathematica, which was a major positivist philosophy tome, and that was considered to be, so Whitehead was considered to be one of the sort of forefathers of logical positivism, which was a very empiricist kind of quantitative approach to thought. And he was an amazing man, because at the age of 60, Whitehead was offered a post at Harvard and got on a liner and crossed the seas and developed a completely new philosophical career, which has now evolved into what we would call continental philosophy, which is a much more ideas-based philosophy than the kind of empiricist philosophy that he'd kind of was brought up with Russell. But one of the things that he said that really influenced me, I wrote it down here. He said we must always avoid the happy simplifications of method. And I thought that was so cool. Yeah, we must always avoid the happy simplifications of method. In other words, he was challenging the positivist philosophies that many of our predecessors at QI and at this conference, people like, again, Caroline and Ron and people have challenged, ultimate ethnography is a challenge to the old positivistic paradigms, isn't it? I mean, it is. So I read Whitehead's book, Process and Reality, and I thought, I'm going to avoid all those happy simplifications of method. Yeah, I'm going to be cantankerous. I'm going to be challenging. Yeah. So I suppose the book Writing is, as I think it's called, I even forget the name of the bloody book. Writing is Immanence. What is it? You'll have to remind me. Writing is imminent doing, isn't it?
Writing and Immanence, Concept Making and the Reorientation of Thought in Pedagogy and Inquiry.
Thank you, Kitrina. So, I mean, I suppose, how on earth I'll put that into a nutshell, I don't know. But I suppose what post-qualitative philosophy practices are really trying to do now is trying to say that we've got to move away from simple representation, simple interpretation, simple, Deleuze called it decalcomania, of transferring one idea to another. Yeah, that we can assume that the idea that works here will work over there, to challenge the whole idea of application, and to work more with immanence, which is being in the moment, in the now. So people like, Virginia Woolf, for example, and a lot of writers and artists talk about immanent practices. Now, it's really difficult to write in an immanent way. It's really difficult to challenge it. But Deleuze and Guattari talk a lot about immanence, being in the moment. So I think it opens up the possibilities. And I know a lot of people do this, maybe people who are here tonight, and a lot of that, we encourage our students to work in more poetic ways. I think about Tammy's, performative work. I think about, people who've brought poetry into their work. That feels to me, this is a more poetic form of experience in the world than simply applying someone else's theory to your work. Yeah, it sort of represents it in what is, I think, is a rather arid and dry sort of way. So I found it a real challenge to write that book, because I started doing it right at the beginning. I went to ECQI, the European conference in Malta in February. When did COVID begin? 2002, wasn't it? No. 2022, wasn't it? Whatever. I know we were in Malta, and people were saying there's an epidemic sweeping across the world, and we just about got home. But I remember talking there about that idea of using this notion of immanence, that writing in ways which aren't simply representational by using other people's ideas. So yeah, it was a hard book to write, to be quite honest with you, because I wrote most of it in the silence and the disconnectedness of COVID. So I had no one to collaborate with, you know.
So I'm going to ask you one more question. I think it'd be really nice if we just open it up for anyone else to
Yeah, fantastic.
Jump
Yeah.
in. So taking this journey that you've had,
yeah.
the impact of the place that you live on your body, and now place that in an autoethnography context, how is all of that shaping how you approach autoethnography and what you feel called to contribute to that area?
Yeah, I mean, I was seduced by autoethnography when I came out to, well, coming out to, you know, to meet everyone out at Urbana-Champaign. I was seduced by it. I think, you know, and it brought so much to me. All of those people, you know, with often like people like Norman, for example, with the sociological background, bringing and challenging the old school empiricist ways. I found it so exciting. But in more recent years, I suppose I've challenged some aspects of autoethnography, and this is not to say all of it, because I think there are autoethnographies rather than autoethnography, for sure. And I think we've got to, particularly in people who are working with post-qualitative inquiry now, are saying we've got to work with the more than simply human. And that's a powerful phrase. We've got to work with the more than simply human. And that, in a sense, brings me back to what you were asking me about earlier, Kitrina, about being by the sea. Yeah, being by the sea, you've got to be more than simply human. Yeah, if you think of the forces that are there in the sea, the wind, the rain, the surf, and so on, you've got to be more than simply human. And I had a sensing, and I don't know when it was, maybe 10 or so years ago, that some aspects, even the auto, which precedes the ethnography, the auto tends to focus upon the being of the I. Yeah. So I've tried to write around that, not to write against it, because obviously the I is really, really important. But I've tried to sort of write in a more relational way. So Deleuze and Guattari, for example, rather than talking about being the individual, Deleuze and Guattari talk about becoming. That yeah, bodies are always becoming something other than what they were before. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, in the wink of an eye, you know, now you see me, now you don't. I've become something else. So that phrase, and I think it came originally from Erin Manning, that we need to work with the more than simply human, made me want to qualify some of the autoethnographic work that I'd written myself and that I'd also seen, because you know, I think some of the less good autoethnography tends to wear its heart on its sleeve and be quite simply human. And that's not to denigrate it, but that feels to me that limits it, yeah, from the kind of relational spaces of connecting with materialities. You know, again, as Spinoza says, all bodies, you know, material or human bodies, have the capacity to affect and be affected. And that's a hugely, use your word, it's a hugely ecological dynamic. Yeah, it's very forceful. It challenges form. Yeah, you know, the formative way of looking at the world. It says there's always another force that's going to come along and shift the comfort of that form. Yeah, so yeah, I'm still working with that now, and I think in a way, you know, writing as an imman doing, practicing in immanence, it's really hard, and it's, you know, it's challenging those what Whitehead called those happy simplifications of method. Yeah, I don't want to use the simple methods. I want to problematize and look for complexity, because they are there. Those complexities are there. You know, have I gone off piste?
Not at all. It's an interesting concept. I'm sure we will play with. so everybody, Ken is here to have conversations with us as a community and a group, and you've been sitting there, I'm sure, with lots of questions of your own or thoughts of your own or rabbit holes that you fancy going down with Ken. So please, you can put your hand up if you like, or just chip in, and let's take it in a way that you would like to move the conversation.
So I'll start. I love everything you said, Ken, and I appreciate hearing about your background. That was wonderful. It's too rare to really, hear people's stories about growing up and so on. And I'm with you. But I find myself having a little hesitation with the post-qualitative. And partly it's a feeling that it is rejecting what came before as opposed to working alongside of. And then second, at least initially when I tried to read it, I just got lost. I mean, there was just so much, what I'm going to call, because I don't have another word to call it, jargon, that I was put off by it. Now, I didn't feel that when I read some of your work so much, but I found myself resistant, and I want to be more open to it, because I don't disagree with anything that you have said today. I find it enlightening, actually. And I found your talk at Kitrina's conference enlightening as well. I said, hey, I think I finally understand this. And and being an animal lover, and being and my animals are always in my stories, and knowing how much the environment and the politics and everything acts back on us and contains us and so forth, I'm all for that. So anyway, I just wanted to express my feeling to you.
Thank you, Carolyn. I appreciate what you say, and it's made me think that there's something really important to say here, because I don't think we should think about, and I think you've encapsulated this really. The post doesn't necessarily mean after or behind. In Karen Barad's reading of the post, is not that comes after, post comes after. It's in, around, and with. And I feel that I'm really interested in a lot of post-qualitative scholars. I mean, a lot of them are my friends, Betty St. Pierre and Maggie McClure and others. I really love their work. And I think probably somewhere where I disagree slightly with Betty is that I feel we can work the post-qualitative inquiries along with and in and around the qualitative inquiries. I think there's a problematic there. I don't think it's straightforward, but I think we can do that. We can do that work. It's not that post-qualitative inquiry somehow has moved on from and has left behind the qualitative. I think it works in and around with it. Yeah, I think it's a simplification again to say, oh, we're moving on and we've left the qualitative behind. There are problems with the qualitative, but I think there are problems with the post-qualitative, as you've said, notwithstanding the language that it often uses. So that's one of the difficult things I've tried to juggle with in my last book, the Immanence one. So yeah, and it's great for us, because I don't think it's a cliche to talk about those of us who've gone to QI for years as a community. Even though people say, how can you talk about a community? Only go there once a year. But it's a definite community where we can look at autoethnography in the context of post-qualitative thought as well. Mm-hmm. That's how I like to think about it anyway. So great. Thanks for your point.
And thank you.
And one of the things Carolyn said there was actually hearing you talking makes sense of things. And that's what I found. I agree exactly with you, Carolyn. A lot of the post-qualitative research I would push back against. And the same with Deleuze and Guattari's work. But when you talked, Ken, and you gave us practical examples, it just then made sense. So there's something to do with, even though they're complex things, there are ways of making them understandable.
I think so. I hope so. Yeah, I suppose it's. I mean, we were talking a little bit this afternoon, Kitrina, about pedagogy, and I suppose, I've got some wonderful down in Plymouth. I've got some wonderful PhD students, and it's lovely to have the conversations with them that can be quite bristly sometimes, and they have a longevity, but it's really important because again, I go back to Whitehead. If we simplify it and say, oh, well, it's this way, then we're often obfuscating and covering over some of the really important complexities that are there, So, yeah, I love having the discussions. I think they're the most important part, really. I was quaking about coming along this evening thinking, oh my goodness, I'm going to have to talk for 50 minutes.
One of the first things I think that people said that I think was it Art said this morning is when you get academics, they never stop talking.
No.
So let me open it up again to some other folks to
Sure, yeah,
reflect on
great,
some of the
fantastic.
things.
I can go ahead and go.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hello, Keith.
Hi,
Thanks,
Kitrina.
Keith.
Hi, Gale.
How you doing,
I
mate?
can. I'm good. How are you? I miss seeing you in the flesh.
Yeah, I hope to see you this year. You're doing well?
I'm well, and I'm so
Good.
happy to be able to listen in on some of this. Yeah, it's so funny that I came in when you were talking about the new materialism.
Sure.
I work with a student, David Dooling, and my faculty colleague, Sonia Ivanchi. They work significantly in it in the organizational communication context. And so I'm learning about it through them. I'm learning about it through Barad. And it's challenging me as a relational communication scholar, right? It's pushing me. It's trying to figure out what it is. And I hope this hasn't already been addressed and I missed it because I came in a little late. And I hope this makes sense. And I love the line about, you wrote, we need to work with more than the simply human.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay, so you're writing a piece, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you're embracing that. You're diving into that. How does that which extends beyond the simply human get integrated into the writing? Is it taken to have a similar weight to the meaningfulness and the presence of the human? Is it more an expanded version of context? So it's kind of not below's a hard word, but it's within. Like, how does, if it's possible to answer that, how does that get included?
It's a great question, Keith, and it's hard to put it into words. Jane Bennett, I don't know if you know Jane Bennett's book. I think it's called Vibrant Matter, but she talks about materiality, and there's a lovely passage in that when she talks about being at a computer and tapping away at the keys, and she hears the bird song outside, and she's feeling hot and sweaty and so on. In other words, there's a whole range of forces which are playing upon her, and it's not simply the sort of cerebral things that are going on in her brain as she's constructing her argument and writing the passage. In other words, she attunes herself to the whole environment. That what Kitrina and I were talking about just now, the kind of ecological, Deleuze calls it the milieu, the whole sort of enmeshed, entangled weave which we are part of. When we come in, I say, well, I feel relaxed here, or I feel uncomfortable there. What is it that causes those differences? It's being attuned to the materiality of space rather than the just working with the concepts alone. So I suppose that the phrase "the more than simply human" is flagging up that we've got to be connected, and in this time of climate crisis is particularly apposite. We've got to be attuned to the more than simply human. We've got to be attuned. I mean, I've noticed it in the sea where I live. The rising temperatures in the water. And little things like that. So it's a sort of call for a greater awareness with relationality, I think, more than anything else. Yeah. That we're like, but Caroline cited Art saying, well, once we get together, we're all doing this all the time. We're talking, it's being attuned to the, if you like, the spiritual world, the material world, and so on. I think, and maybe writing more about that, or writing more with that, not writing about it, but writing with that.
Christopher Poulos, you've
got yeah. So what you just said, like, first of all, Ken, you and I share the background of being unemployable philosophy majors as after undergrad. But what you just said took me back to my dissertation, which was in part a meditation on the work of Maurice Merleau-Ponty and his phenomenology of perception, and that being attuned to what's going on, what's in the surrounding, more than just human, right? And and then I tried to bring in that into conversation with Emmanuel Levinas, who's really all about is, I guess what it strikes me is when I hear you speak, and when I read your writing, and I have these indelible images of running into you and Jonathan in the hall at QI, or you and they're very vivid memories of you and Jonathan and Ron and Tammy and Larry Russell presenting your collaborative works.
Yes,
and
yeah,
almost always feel this, the image that comes into my mind in that is the Greek myth of Tantalus. There's this kind of aspect to it of it's just out of reach. Like
yes,
you're
yes,
trying to say the ineffable, and you're kind of
yes,
you're doing it, but it's like I'm like reaching outward to kind of follow what you're doing, and it's actually quite lovely. It's a little bit like when I don't know, it's like music. It's hard to say what moves you, but you know that it did.
yeah.
And I kind of love that about your work.
Thanks,
And
Chris. Yeah,
yeah,
I loved what you said, and I was talking with Kitrina this afternoon, and I remember meeting Tammy for the first time, and Tammy's a force, isn't she? But what I learned from Tammy was that it wasn't so much saying the words, it was showing them. Yeah, that panel that we had with Larry and so on, Larry, bless him, he would be moved to tears quite often, and it would take a long time for the words to come out. But when they did, they were so full of force, And I think that's something that you can't pin it down. You can't, as you were suggesting, Chris. It's really hard to pin down. But in a sense, for us who've been in the work for now a long time, 20, 30 years, whatever it is, I think we have a responsibility to do that. We've got all these lovely young scholars who are coming through and doing really exciting work. And I think, we mustn't sort of, I'm not suggesting that we would. I think we've got to carry on being, challenging, pushing the boundaries. I think we've got to carry on avoiding the happy simplifications of method, So yeah, great. Thank you for what you said. And I've forgotten about Levinas. That's a good reminder.
Well, I think that would be a good time to draw this session to a close. It's 21:49 and we're supposed to finish at 20:15. And as you know from if you come to the conference that I run, we pull people off when they're overrun. So we don't, but it's been brilliant, Ken. I hope that you've enjoyed talking about that, and I hope everyone that's from this side of the pond staying up late.
Yeah.
It's been good.
Kitrina,
Thank you so much. Sorry?
Can I just say thank you to Caroline and Tony and the group for inviting me in the first place. I'm really, really grateful to be invited. That's fantastic. And I want to say a very, very special thank you to you, Kitrina, for looking after me in my hour of need this morning when poor Suzanne told us that she wasn't going to be able to make it. I'm really grateful for you rocking up and supporting me through this. So thank you so much. And thanks for everyone who's chipped in and participated and had something to say today. It's been lovely to see you all and hear you. I hope we get together in the flesh quite soon.